Welcome to my talk. So, like I was mentioning, this is basically, I wrote this book a little while ago that was finally published a couple weeks ago called Monolithic Transformation. And by book, I mean like a 100-page thing. One of those funny little skinny books that O'Reilly makes. They call them reports, but that seems annoying. I don't want to run around saying I made a report. Basically, what's in that book, and what I'm going to go over briefly, as I was mentioning, is I've spent most of my time over the past however many years studying how organizations do software. I used to be a software developer and be an industry analyst following software, so I'm always interested in how they think about software and how they improve it, and how they sort of align it to whatever goals the organization has to the business, or whatever the non-technical part, whatever you're using the software for. And so it's all about, if organizations are building their own software, they're writing it and running it, what's the best way of going about doing that? I think, let me start off. I won't introduce myself, but I'll give you a brief summary. And here's like the little book if you're interested. If you go to my Twitter account, you can find a link to it, or you go to cote.coffee and you can get a copy for free. You know, you have to give Pivotal your email address.
Coffee or a coffee?
Well, it's on Coffee, and you can get a copy. But to summarize it, and I'll go through this very quickly as you know, I'll be presenting a lot of this. In general, when it comes to improving the way software is done, I think the general thing that we sort of have to accept, otherwise I have nothing to say, is that if you have faster cycles of releasing the software, like on a weekly basis, it'll generally improve the software. Because one, you can reliably make, you know, you can release to production to fix bugs. You also can pay attention to how people are using software and improve it on a weekly, if not daily basis. And it also forces you to scope down the changes to be much smaller than gigantic, gargantuan releases. So generally, the faster your release cycle, the better software is. And you know, over the past almost 10 years now, this idea of DevOps, making sure developers understand and care about how their stuff runs in production, and making sure operations people think more like developers, has really done a great job to help speed that up. But it sort of reached this this point that it's this ceiling, if you will. And there's some new stuff that's been coming on, some new technologies that basically are making it much easier for organizations to get to the point where they actually can deploy reliably on a daily basis, instead of the kind of quarterly basis that we'll see people are stuck in. Now, once you get to the point where you can release software very quickly, then we'll get into the rest of it, which is basically, what do the developers look like team-wise when they're working on their software week to week, and what practices they follow. And then also, what's the thing I was originally going to talk about, what's this platform that's running, and how do people think about how they run that? And then also, especially in large organizations, which is most of what I study, all of this is wonderful for like 1 or 2 teams, but then when you have hundreds of teams, unless you actually have management and leadership also reprogramming the organization, you know, then it's sort of meaningless. Kind of fun, but it's not really going to affect the organization very much. So that's a general, you know, you can, there's a lot of stuff I'll be skipping over, but you know, there's more stuff written up in that report that we can get to. So an example of good software, just to be very brief about it, is essentially, this is an example from Orange, and basically, I'll give you the very short version. They had call centers that you would call up to figure out what your bill was as a small business. And I don't know how y'all are, but no one likes using the phone. And it's very expensive to staff a phone. And so essentially, they wanted to replace calling into the call center with a piece of software that you would use to interact with them. Now, most businesses that I've interacted with it, right, you use their software, and like, it's usually kind of difficult to find exactly what you want, right? They kind of have more of an idea of, here's all the information we have about you, separated into all these different tabs, and you can go and find the little bits and pieces that you want. So normally on a regular release cycle, what would happen is you would put the software out maybe every year or so, or every 6 months if you were lucky, and you probably wouldn't pay that much attention to how people are actually using it, and instead you would kind of interpret and guess the best way to do features. But what Orange was doing, and there's similar stories like this with organizations that do their software really well, is because they could release their software about every week or so, what they were able to do is to actually study how people are using the software. And they would come up with an idea of like, have we actually made the users more productive? Have we solved problems that they had? And there's a few like sort of obvious learnings that they came to once you think about it. But when it comes to showing, you know, whether it's a little grocery store or just a little shop, showing them the bill that they have or the sort of service that they have with Orange, getting their internet, it turned out that most of those organizations, when they studied it, all they wanted to know really was like, give me the current bill. Like, I just want to pay the current bill and I don't want to see all this other stuff. So they were able to release the software every week and study what was going on with it and how people were using it. And they eventually got to this more of this interface where it was very efficient and quick for users to go in, find their bill and pay it, and then see how employees, for example, were using the phones that they were selling to them. And so what's important up there, you know, about this result is, one, it solved their problem of people not using the call center. And they were able to essentially get this application out in about 1/3 less time than they normally would, right? So it was very, very rapidly that they got this application out, doing a lot of what I'll talk about the rest of the time. And then equally good is about half of their customers started using this application, right? So you often hear about a new application that you've been working on for a while, it gets released, and then, I don't know, 10% of people use it. Like, people don't really use the software as much as you might like to. So getting to this point where you can release your software on a weekly basis and study how people are using it and not worrying about all the infrastructure and things that you have. This is sort of like, in a very quick way, an example of software being done well, right? It's not released very long. It doesn't take a long release cycle to get out. And equally importantly, you actually are studying how people are using it, and you're improving the software on a weekly basis to make sure that they're using, the people, your customers using it are doing it in the most efficient way possible, and they're not griping about it. And you see that with the engagement that they had. But, you know, given that I'm at a Java user group, y'all probably don't care at all about business things. That's probably not anything you're concerned about. So it's sort of like, yay for business, I don't care. But you're probably more interested in the technical side of things and sort of a goal that we can have to shoot for that improvement. And I think, as I've mentioned to some extent, I think this is more, and I'll tell you what this is, but I think this is more of a goal, if you don't care about the business side, to shoot towards. And as I was alluding to earlier, right, like this idea that if we have fast release cycles, we'll improve our software, right? It'll be more resilient because we can fix bugs that we found. It'll be more productive. The design will be better because we can put new features out more frequently and study how people are doing it. So we really want to get to this point where we can release on, let's say, a weekly basis. So what this chart shows you is that I like this chart because no one can really read it, so I can tell you exactly what I want you to think about it and how to interpret it, which I'm about to do right now. But what this shows you is over the past 5 years, if I can still count correctly, this is a survey about how often does your organization release software. So what basis are you releasing it on? And you can see that basically over the past 5 years, we've been stuck at about 1/4, right? So we're not really in the area where, like, I guess this is an average, so, you know, there's outliers here and there. But there's people who release every year or more, you know, especially if you're in the military, you release every like 5 or 12 years. Or, you know, there's people who release daily. But in general, it's safe to think that we basically, releasing quarterly is sort of like the industry benchmark, right? Which, I don't know, it's pretty lame. Right? So we need to figure out like how to move that curve over, more over to the right, right? Like, how do we get to the point where we can start releasing every week and be confident enough to start releasing every day instead? So I think that's a good goal to shoot for, right? And, you know, we'll let those business people figure out if they can make money off it or not. No big deal for us. So I think it's worth thinking about, like, so how did we, you know, how did we get to this kind of stalled out point, right? Because everything's been going great, right? We've got containers and like DevOps and all of these great things that have been speeding it up. So now everything should be dandy, right? Well, and you know, I work at a vendor at Pivotal, and I think it's probably a large part of the vendor's fault, the people making the infrastructure software. And so if you haven't seen this is the Cloud Native Computing Foundation. Is that right? CNCF. And basically, these are like all the infrastructure components and all of the sort of like service management, all the things that if you were to build out a container-driven application that like is done in a modern best practices way, these are all the options you have, right? This is like the grocery store. of compute at the moment. And so there's a lot of different options, so to speak, to go through here and things to sort through. And as we'll get to, I think a large part of what is causing our slowdown is having to not only know about all these components and then select all of these components, but then also integrate and wire up all these components and then do the ongoing management of upgrading each of them and making sure they work and troubleshooting them, right? And I mean, I'm from a vendor, so you can guess what my solution is to that, but we'll get to that later. So, however, I think it is worth thinking about, like, how did we get to the point where we can do quarterly releases or so, and kind of study that historically to figure out why this is why this is broken down and how we might start addressing it. So if you remember your DevOps, your basics, right? Again, the idea of DevOps was like, we need to release software more frequently, and the reason that we don't release software more frequently is these developers here, they're great at making builds because they have a Scrum Master, and they figured out how to do that. So they can do these monthly builds. But the problem comes, well, one, there's QA, which they solve very quickly, right? So the first thing you do, is you get your QA people, and like all great developers, the way you solve a problem, I don't know how many people are developers here. So we've got one. As he knows, the way that developers solve problems is they make other people developers, right? They're like, I'm awesome. So the way to solve any problem is to be a developer, clearly. So basically, in the early 2000s, they take over QA and kind of eliminate them as a barrier. And now developers do a lot of QA. And then the next thing that happens is, they're doing these builds, and you've got these operations people who run production. And what operations people know is every time they go from like the developer environment with their magic builds and they try to release it, everything breaks, right? So like developers basically bring down production. Now the operations people, their job is to keep production up. So just using basic, I'm not a psychologist, but basic psychology, basically what the operations people do is never deploy software because then they accomplish their job. Now, of course, they can't literally do that, but they put up, as we had earlier, this wall here, and I think my friend and boss Andrew Clay Schaefer termed this the wall of confusion, right? So you've got tickets and ITEL and ITSM and change review boards, all of these things that are basically slowing down, or I should say, improving the quality and ensuring that your releases will succeed, or making sure you release as little as possible. So that didn't really work for companies that were trying to compete based on features and software. So a lot of what DevOps did was basically, move your operations people over here, right? Again, developers know the best way to solve any problem is to make them a developer. So you make your operations people developers, and then your business people are happy because you're releasing more frequently, you're getting more features out. Everything's awesome. You probably can't see, but that's Boss Hogg having a big lunch, if you remember him. I never know how my Dukes of Hazzard jokes will play. I should probably use different ones. But I think what came along, as I was mentioning, with that big cloud native computing thing. So now instead of a wall of confusion, we've got all this configuration stuff that we need to handle, right? So whenever you deal with building up your containers and orchestrating things and doing whatever serverless is, or I don't know if it's functions, or you're building a platform of whatever all these things are. I don't really program anymore, but my programming friends, he probably knows since he's the programmer, there's always a lot of YAML involved. Like you write some JavaScript and maybe some Go or Java, and then it's just you spend a few days doing YAML or something like that so you can deploy it. And then you have to deploy it to production, so there's more YAML. And there's probably some YAML you can write for your YAML so that it pre-processes it and puts environment variables in. But like I said, I just make slides, I don't know. So this introduces a new problem, which I think is what I find people are encountering and slowing down a lot, is now you have this wall of YAML, which is basically between you and releasing to production, right? And then this slows down, right? It gets us to this quarterly basis, right? Which used to be awesome. Our business people used to be very happy that we could deliver quarterly because it used to be yearly. But really, like, they're spying on us now there. But, really, like, you get something good, and about a month later, you're very upset that it hasn't improved fivefold, right? You forget very quickly how terrible it used to be. So now, everyone's upset because they got to deal with YAML, and they can't deploy all the time. The business is very upset because now you can't deploy weekly, right? And then your users are sitting over there just bored, right? They're waiting for new features to come out. Like, probably, if we're here at this meeting, you're like me, like you get excited when there's little updates in the App Store or wherever, because you want to see what new features are there, and then they're always just like, we've just improved the undercarriage. And it's kind of a letdown, right? Like you want new features to do things with. So now, how you might want to solve this problem is you might want to sort of like build out a platform and think about like, we would like to provide a centralized platform so people don't have to do so much YAML, right? Like the way you address that is instead of having to assemble all these things and worry about how you combine them together, how you integrate them, how you upgrade them, a very common pattern that's come up is you have your operations people coming in and saying, all right, we'll build you that platform. Now some people, the platform they choose is like public cloud instead, right? Which, if you think about it, they're building you a platform as well that you're relying on. And let's play it again. This is the slide I put in, so I'm a little like out of surface. But you end up with this situation as developers, right? You never like centralize things, because you always ask your centralized people to implement some feature, and it takes like forever, right? Like you say, I need to run Kafka in here or whatever. And they're like, that sounds great. In 2 years, we'll deliver that for you, because we've got a big backlog of things. So over the past like 10 or 15 years, I think that's what we expect from basically centralizing anything in IT, right? They always want us to use this ESB or this SOA thing or this app server, and then it kind of gets like frozen in place after a year or two, and you can't add new features to it. I mean, it's especially bad in the ERP space. I used to do a lot of work with ERP people who are kind of in the continental Europe area. And their users used to always complain that like we're about 3 versions back on something, so we don't get all the new versions of things. So this is the expectations that people have when you start mentioning centralizing the way that you're going to do your platforms, to remove the need for the developers to focus on building up that infrastructure and really remove the need for them to do a lot of what we would consider DevOps things, and instead focus on the actual application that they have instead of infrastructure building. So addressing that concern, right? Like if I'm going to suggest that we should centralize the way we run our platform and centralize the infrastructure, most developers are going to say that's a terrible idea and figure out a way to avoid it. But this is, the talk I was originally going to give is based on this one layer, which is you provide your platform as a product. So instead of providing your platform as a set of services that people use and hiding out behind a help desk and kind of worrying about static governance of things, instead you think about, and this might be hard for, if he's the only developer, I don't know if everyone else is operations people or you just were here for the free pizza. But operations people in general, like if you think about your prototypical developer, how they kind of sort of don't want to talk to anyone, just to be like stereotypical. Like operations people, it reminds me of my favorite shirt that basically says, not an introvert, just don't like you. And I think that's kind of like the operations mentality, right? So when you tell your operations people that maybe you should care about the developers, about the people running on your platform, you should think about them as your customers and run it as a product, right? Where you're paying attention to what they want and evolving that product. It can be a little weird for them to think about that, but increasingly, if you go back to the idea of getting your software releases down to a weekly basis, and people like Orange who've improved the way they do their software, you somehow get your operations people to think about the platform as a product. And I'll go over what that means very briefly. So there's a couple of roles that you typically see on these teams. And let me first go to what the end goal is. I pasted those in there wrong. So the first thing that this platform team does, right? So let's think about that organization structure that I had, which was basically, you've got your developers up on top, basically. They're writing software and worrying about how people want to use it. They're thinking, this person in a small grocery store just wants to see their bill, so I'd like to experiment with this one way of putting there and get that to production in a week so I can observe if that solved their problem doing that their way. Now, underneath the developers, instead of writing all their YAML and worrying about configuring things, they have a platform running that automates a lot of that for them and allows them to basically just say, here's my container, or here's my application, just run it for me, right? Now, getting to that point where you don't actually have to worry about configuring all the nodes that you have and attaching it to your storage, making sure you have all your security things taken care of, doing a very sort of DevOps idea of how you're doing your development, right? Not only your application development, but also managing all the infrastructure. It takes a lot of automation and a lot of removing what site reliability engineer people would call toil, right? So toil is this idea. There's all sorts of ways of defining it, but it's basically if there's some manual repetitive task that I'm doing that doesn't have to do with a feature that a person is actually using, and it takes like 50% of my time to do these manual things, or I do it like a couple times a week or a day, it's a little fuzzy. These are basically tasks that have like no value for the end user. And so what I should do, my first priority should be to automate that toil, to make it so I don't have to do it at all. And you see this a lot nowadays, right? Like I don't have to, I mean, from way far away, I don't have to manually configure servers. I can automatically request, a developer can automatically request like a cluster of servers that they want. They can set up the routing for load balancers, all sorts of things like that with the properly functioning platform. But it really takes that centralizing your platform, your infrastructure, so that there's not people duplicating all the way that they're doing it. But then with your operations people, what it takes is a lot of work to constantly be reducing toil and constantly be automating things. And again, I think that's something that operations people aren't necessarily always tuned towards, right? They're usually given a service to implement, and they have to go off and implement that service for you, right? They don't think about how do I continually improve this and think about what my end users, my customers are doing, and experiment with better ways of solving their problem, which is a product mentality, if you think about it. So just as an example, very quickly, right? So here's an example from Daimler, or Mercedes. And they were working on an application here, and their operations people were trying to reduce toil to speed up that release cycle. And by doing a value stream, value stream mapping, what they found is there was this part of toil, of wasted time, that basically was when a developer wants to get servers to test out their software. They have to fill out a ticket, and they wait, I don't know if you do sort of like a visual map there, they wait about 5 or so days to basically put that request in, have that request approved, and then get the resources that they need to set up their developer environment, and to set up the labs environment that they have. So I don't know about you, but I've never really walked into a car dealership and said, first thing, what I really like is how perfectly you provision servers. That 5 days you spend doing it is just perfect, right? It's cooked very well, right? So from a customer's perspective, provisioning servers is useless, right? I mean, obviously you need the servers, so there's nothing running on it. But that's a kind of a way of thinking about what should we automate and what should we remove. So because they had this toil removing mentality, the operations people were able to automate that away and make it, only a couple of hours that it would take you to get your servers. So again, when you centralize that across a whole organization, you get really great efficiencies because each different development team doesn't have to figure out doing that automation again. So what you end up seeing is when you can centralize and the way you're running your platform, your infrastructure, you get huge efficiencies, right? So here's a couple examples of organizations that have managed to centralize their platform. And they have, for about 300 developers, they have just 8 operations people supporting it over at T-Mobile, and they support about 11,000 containers at that. And there's a retailer where they're supporting about 120 developers with 6 operations people, which for most large organizations, those ratios are like almost unbelievable. You usually have a lot more operations people supporting platforms that you're running. So let's look a little bit at what these platforms are and what we're centralizing into the platform team. And instead, I guess you could look at it as taking away from developer teams. So there's 2 core things that this platform team ends up doing, right? And again, think of the platform team as operations evolved into providing a platform as a product, not just providing a bunch of services that people rely on, or a sort of a stream of VMs and provisioning hardware and things like that. So the first thing that often happens is you have one kind of centrally governed build pipeline, or a continuous integration and continuous deployment pipeline. And the reason that you do this is, I'm sure, if you've switched around teams, right? Like the build is often different if you're not centralizing the way you're doing things. The way that you run your pipeline, whether it's Jenkins or something else, is slightly different. You don't tend to get efficiencies from running things having a pipeline in the same way. Again, because you're used to asking some centralized person to do something and it never really evolves, right? They don't worry about evolving and adding new features to it and innovating on top of it. But once you get this pipeline put in place and you have it standardized, and again, this is what I see most large organizations doing, is one of the top things they do is they have one centralized build pipeline. I should say one type of doing it. instead of having every different team be able to choose the way that they go about doing it. So your platform team, and by team it's a lot more than just one team, but your platform organization tends to take on the task of providing this build pipeline for you, again because it adds huge efficiencies to the overall organization. So the next, this is kind of like from one of some of my friends at Pivotal, a definition of all the stuff that's in a platform. All of the various functions that you need to worry about, from operational things to the frameworks that developers use to your security concerns and networking. So this is sort of like your target board for toil removal. And the idea is, generally, like if you think about if I'm starting from scratch as a developer, these are kind of like an assortment of the things I need to figure out and write a platform around and automate and figure out how all of it might fit together to run my application. And oftentimes, automating all of this and making it so again the developers don't need to worry about it is a huge part of what your platform is. Just making it so that mostly that your developers worry pretty much about the top couple of things on this stack, right? All they're concerned about is not setting up their infrastructure, not setting up how services talk with each other, but all of that stuff is taken care of in their platform instead. And of course, I mean, this kind of looks like everything that you would need, but that's really the point of once you automate most all of this in the platform, you get those efficiencies much better. So just to give you one quick example of what a platform in place looks like. So this is an example from the US Air Force. If you remember my little aside about taking 12 years to deploy software, they used to be like that. And because they've centralized their platform, and because they're evolving that platform and have centralized the pipelines that they have, usually it would take them, this is just one example of governance that would slow people down. That would be that wall that would slow things down. So usually it would take them, whenever they had just one line of code to release, the developers that worked, for example, on one line of code, it would take them basically like 10 months to go through the auditing process. Because the auditor, the security people, the compliance people would have to check this entire stack from their actual application to their databases, to the runtime environment, all the way down to the storage and the networking and everything. And the reason they would have to do that is because every single application had its own stack built, right? So the development team had worked on this stack to support it. So whenever they put one line of code out, they of course have to go validate everything in there. But because they had centralized their platform and they'd focused on doing that and put this idea of a platform as a product in place, what they did is it took them a long time, but they won over the trust of the auditing team. And basically, they weren't changing this part of the platform, right? And think about how this works with sort of a public cloud service that you use, right? If you're deploying something to public cloud, you're not really changing the infrastructure as a service, the public cloud back there. You're just changing the code that you have, so you don't really need to go check on that and audit it so much. And that's a similar thing you get with the platform once you put it in place, is you don't change that as often, and it's not different and varied. And so you get the ability to really speed up not only auditing cycles, but security cycles, all of these various things, because it's no longer something developers are touching and messing up. So that's the first vital thing to put in place, is basically, how do we get a centralized platform in place so that developers no longer are concerned with that wall of YAML and integrating things together? So let's say we have that platform in place. And now we have the ability for developers to basically, again, just like you would expect with cloud, to not worry about requesting various types of infrastructure you have, having to worry about how we wire together your database to your registry, to all these things, how we govern that, and how we make sure that we've got security patches deployed, all these things that a platform takes care of you, as long as you trust as a developer that this platform is going to evolve. So the question is, what do developers actually do? How do they think about how they go about doing their weekly tasks and improving software? And I think a lot of this is ending up doing what we should have been doing all along, but now, because we don't have to worry about all of this infrastructure management, we can go back to focusing on the actual product that we have. So the first thing that you'll notice, right? So we've got a platform running underneath here that automates most everything for us. And then we end up making these various teams that are very product-centric. So you have what we would call in Pivotal a balance team, or a team with an engineer, a designer, and a product manager that's fully dedicated to each of the products that they're working on end to end, right? So they don't just work on the one portion of it. they work on a sort of, well, I'll just give you an example. So for example, you might have one team that their lives must be very exciting that works on the mortgage application or loan applications. There might be another team that is in charge of the service of approving those mortgages. You could have another team that works on transfers, or however you might want to break it up into components. But the point is, each of these teams are a product team focused on the sort of the full concern of someone paying a bill. We understand who that user is. Every week we're paying attention to people who are paying bills, and we are all dedicated to every week working on features for that team, for that customer. So this is the general methodology if you have a product team, right? So you're delivering a product, not, for example, we are the, I don't know, the pagination framework team that's in charge of taking data from a database, munging it all together and presenting it to someone. Instead, we are the like banking history team. So we're in charge of the UI and gathering it from the back end. We have a full end-to-end thing that we pay attention to. And then there's this methodology that you're able to put into place if you're a dedicated product team that now you actually have time to follow on a weekly basis. And this gets to that idea of how you're improving the design of your software and improving the features by actually taking a very design-driven approach. So the first thing that you do, and again, think about this on a weekly basis, is you come up with a theory of how to solve a problem, right? And so I'll give you an example if I go through this of, there's an example from the tax collector in the US, where if you're delinquent paying your taxes, you really would like to know how much you need to pay your taxes on a daily basis, because every single day you owe more penalty on it. So there was an idea that the tax collector in the US, the IRS, Internal Revenue Service, had of what we'll do is we'll show you your complete financial history with us, and you can kind of go search through it and find how much taxes you owe now, and that will solve your problem. So that was their theory of when we make software for people to look up how much they owe, we will show them this complete financial history and they'll find out how much they know. So how do you test out a theory? The way you test out a theory in development is you write some code and you put it in front of a user. So you've come up with a theory of how to solve the problem, you build an experiment, and then you actually observe and measure if it worked, right? So we put this complete history of someone's finances in front of them, and now we're going to watch them and see if that allows them to figure out how much taxes they owe and pay it very rapidly. So they put this in front of users, so they actually tested this, and they found out that people were very confused about finding that amount that they owed, and they would frequently want to call up the IRS instead of using the software, which, and this is a very common story, anytime you have to use a phone in a business is terrible. Like, people always want to eliminate using a phone because it's very costly and your customer service goes down, and you would rather them self-service do it. So there was a failure in their experiment, right? So the theory of how they would solve that problem didn't pan out. Now, if they had been delivering on, let's say, a yearly basis, right, it would have taken them a year to discover that they had done this incorrectly, and another year or maybe 6 months to correct that problem. So they would have a very slow feedback loop of how they were solving that problem. But because they had put a platform in place, they have some teams focused on that, they're able to actually on a weekly basis make these experiments and then incrementally change them until they discover the right way of doing it, right? So by deploying on a weekly basis, they can learn by observing what their experiments were, and they go through that cycle over and over again. So this is the basic cycle that I see organizations going through when they get to that point where their product teams, their developers, are solely focused on going through this loop. And just to illustrate the point, right, what the IRS ended up with is it turns out when you want to know how much money you owe the IRS, all you want to know is how much money you owe the IRS. You just want to know the taxes that you pay. And again, it's easy to kind of chuckle at that, but chances are, right, like if, we're very technical people, we always have lots of like data and logs and things. It's fun to show off all the different data that you have and have these big pages of things that you scroll through. It's sort of like, if you log into like Facebook or other things, you kind of relive your memories of your relationship with your tax collector and the IRS. But it often takes a lot of experimentation and observing how users are actually using it to find the very simple thing that just show that one number, let them pay it, and be out. Which, if you remember the example with Orange, is very similar, right? Like, instead of showing you your complete transactional history, they showed you the one thing that you really wanted to know, which is how much money you owed that month. So just to give you a brief idea of what these teams are composed of, right, which is slightly different than the way most organizations are set up. So they're composed primarily of 3 roles. And these roles, of course, we have engineers or developers, right? I was thinking, we'll probably always have humans writing code, because the people who would write robots and code to write code are the engineers, and they're probably smart enough not to code themselves out of a job. So we'll probably always have humans writing code. And then you have this role that's kind of weird to have on a team. Every now and then it's in an organization, but all of those product teams, right, from bill pay, if you remember, to showing you the taxes that you owe, kind of what's going on there, so transfers, they tend to have a designer on the team as well. And the designer, of course, will tell you, this year we're going to have serifs on our fonts versus not, and we're going to have flat buttons versus drop shadows. So they tell you all those funny things. But more of what they're doing is thinking about what's the workflow users should go through. How should we arrange the page that we have, the pixels on the screen? How should the features best be implemented? And they work with that team fully dedicated every week. And having that role of designer on the team is much different than software usually is, right? They're usually often some UX organization writing documents and sending you printouts and weird things like that. They send you wireframes to implement as developers. And then the other role that you have is an actual product manager on the team, which if you worked at a vendor, a product manager is something you always have on a team, right? Because you're selling a product. But I found that in most organizations that aren't software vendors, they tend to have maybe a project manager or a development manager who's basically making sure you're keeping things on track and they're making sure that you're progressing. But a product manager is more of an owner of that product, and they understand who the users are, why they use it, kind of what the business reasons for doing things are. So, for example, a product manager would be the one who is thinking, it's terrible that people want to pick up the phone to call Orange or the IRS, because the business side of things is we need to reduce them doing that. So I want to make sure that I'm prioritizing the features that we're doing to really drive down the value, the business value of what we're doing. So instead of just letting people experiment with what features they might think need to be in there, the product manager is in charge of saying every single release, for the goals that we have with this product, here's the features I want you to implement. So they prioritize the backlog for you. So on each of these teams, you tend to have these 3 roles. And then the other important thing, just to mention very briefly, is that most of these teams, or I should say all of the successful ones, and again, this is one of those things where like you just follow the practices you should have been doing all along, but now you have the time to do it. They actually follow a lot of the agile principles that you think people should be following after 25 years. So when you look at surveys of organizations, I used to be an industry analyst, so I really like surveys. But when you look at most surveys, people don't actually follow all the practices of agile very often. They do a lot of refactoring, which is easy because we all know how to use the right button on a mouse. But for the most part, things drop off after refactoring. And they certainly don't tend to do things like test-driven development and pair programming and follow shorter iterations, right? Again, if you think about doing your deploys on a quarterly basis, you're not doing those weekly deploys. But what's important when you have these product teams together is that, one, they all work with each other every week, right? So they are the team. They're not reporting to separate organizations. But they're very disciplined and rigorous about actually doing things like test-driven development and actually doing pair programming and following these practices, which I only emphasize, again, because when you talk with most people, they don't really follow those practices very much. So the next in our little whirlwind tour, let's look at usually what's everyone's favorite part, because we get to make fun of them a little bit, but this management layer up here, right? So to summarize, we've got these business people up here, which again, we don't care about. That's, as long as they keep paying our bills and buying us fancy computers, they're doing great. So you've got this business that you're writing the software for, or it could be like a government institution that you're implementing services for. And then we have our developers who are very focused on the actual products that they're working on. And every week they're thinking about how can we make our users' lives better, and how do we use that weekly cycle to incrementally improve the design of our product. And then we have our platform team over here, who basically has removed as much toil from the experience of deploying and running applications as possible by finally being able to centralize a platform. So then finally we're left with like, well, what do all of these like enterprise architects and executives do? Because we haven't really mentioned them very frequently. Well, if you think about the size of a large organization, which, depending on what you think large is, might be anywhere from, like you look at someone, I think, like one of the large, big global banks, JP Morgan Chase, has anywhere between like 19,000 and 25,000 developers. So that's a lot of developers, at least last I checked. And at that scale, definitely with this like really quick presentation I've given, you can't just give them that presentation and expect them to like go fix everything, right? Like changing the way that, let's say 19,000, changing the way that 19,000 developers work and how they help support the business side of things takes a lot of management and a lot of effort, right? And introducing a new way of doing things like having these unified product teams, like you're going to be changing and restructuring the organization. So at some point, if you want to move beyond 3 or 4 teams, it's really important to have actual executives involved. And actually what they end up doing, which I think is kind of an interesting use of, I don't know if you would call it recursion, maybe it's more of that old dry, don't repeat yourself thing, is if you remember that fast feedback loop process where you come up with a theory of how to solve a problem, you write code, you observe people using it, you see if it solved your problem or not, and you run through the cycle again. Similarly, what I see managers doing is they run through that loop with their organization. So what's the best way for me to reprogram that organization? How do I continually experiment with the right way to structure things, the right sort of process and culture to put into place? So what I've seen time and time again is that having executives in place who are doing all the usual executive stuff, doing your vision and your strategy, but also really working to reprogram the organization becomes vital and key, right? Like your organization is not going to change. And you might as well go back to doing things in the old way. Like oftentimes an executive comes in, I'm sure things are great at your jobs or places you've worked with, but you might go talk with people at other organizations and they're very upset about the new change initiative that's going on. Because every year, usually an executive comes through and they say like, we're going to do things in a new optimized way, and this year we're going to do something with multicolored belts. And this year we're going to do some sort of agile and scrum thing. And then we're going to be like level 3.5 at some big maturity model. And now we're going to do DevOps. And so every year you're supposed to do something new. And then usually what happens is the executive goes away and doesn't come back until next year. And then they show up and then they say, hey, how come we didn't accomplish anything? And we're doing everything in the same way. Now I'm going to punish everyone and you don't get your bonus. So basically, what you end up learning is that every time an executive tells you to do something, you do the exact opposite, and then next year you'll be fine, right? This is a general rule of how to work in a large organization, right? So here we come in, we're like, you're going to have lots of autonomy and self-direction and do DevOps and all this great stuff, and then obviously you should not be doing that. Oh, is that good? There we go. Well, maybe if I stand here. Anyhow, so let's look at some actual tactics that I think executives can do that are effective. And I think they're also a way for you as an individual, right? Like if you're working in a big organization and you're being told, now we're going to be DevOpsing or now we're going to be doing this. Like it's really good to have a way to test how serious people are to see how much energy you should expend doing it versus just maintaining what you're doing so that you can stay employed or work somewhere else. Like we have a pretty good referral bonus at Pivotal. So if you find out that people want you to transform, you should talk with my friend over there and he can guide you to some better jobs that are much more delightful than doing the same old thing over and over again. But first of all, I think there's something interesting that I see happening. And this is something that takes, again, it's an example of why having management be supportive of this change is important. And what I see happening quite frequently is it's very difficult to change an existing organization. So think of the scale of like 10 to 20,000 developers in a giant organization, right? And your job is you're going to transform that organization. You've heard about digital transformation, and you're going to digitally transform, I guess, from analog to digital. I'm not really sure why it needs digital in there. But oftentimes that's very difficult, if not impossible. And so something I've noticed organizations doing over and over again is they follow this, this notion that I jokingly think of as an immutable organization, which is to say, once an organization is put into place, it's impossible to change it, and you shouldn't change it. You should just create a new organization. So this happens over and over again where, because there's been some initial success with some pilot projects, what management does is they set up a brand new organization and they kind of start small. So you might have 3 teams in this new organization, and then as you're more successful, you might get to 4 to 5. You might add more and more teams in this new organization. And it's often called like a labs, or hopefully not a center of excellence, which has a kind of a bad rap from the past 10 years or so. But you set up this brand new organization, and you're not sort of saddled with the old norms and processes of the older one as you start up. So you build up this success with your older organization, and eventually you start moving more and more people over to there. And this has a couple of interesting effects. One, you don't have to follow the old process because you've got a new organization. But 2, often what happens is, in addition to being able to set up a new organization, and also you also have to have lots of big open spaces that are very well lit. So if you don't have those, and like ping pong tables and foosball, you're going to be a failure. So make sure you have that as well. But another good benefit of setting up a new organization is you essentially take people on a more or less volunteer basis, right? So what you do is, instead of going to every single developer and every single team and saying, we're going to do things in a new way, and I'm going to make you work with designers and product managers, and you're going to be releasing your software weekly, you more take volunteers and people who are willing to go over there. And for better or worse, this has the effect that kind of when you're done, people self-select to what they would like to do. So if there's people who enjoy doing things in the old way, they're like really into PLSQL or something like that, or they just want to keep doing things on a yearly basis, they get to stay in the older organization and support your RPG systems or AS400s or whatever they're into. And instead, you've moved all the interesting, willing people who are actually interested in doing things in a new way over to the new organization. Now, an important aspect of that is to not only pick people who are sort of like high achievers and real go-getters and experts and things like that. You do want to move over anyone who's kind of willing and interested in doing things in a new way in this organization. Because if you only focus on people who are sort of the stereotypical profile of, stays up all night and codes and solves problems and all this heroic stuff, as you're trying to win more and more people over to doing things in this new way, right? And this is kind of a management strategy. What's going to happen is, let's say you've done 3 projects and you got all these high achievers on that team, or you can say ninja or rock star, or as I would prefer, like really annoying young people who do a lot of like late night work. You're going to try to win over more people in your organization as management and say, hey, we should be doing 10 projects like that. And everyone is going to say, well, of course, if I had all these like ninjas, I would be very successful at any application I would do, right? But instead, I've got all these regular people, and which I guess is a depressing comment on what people think of their staff if they think of them as regular people. But so you want to make sure to staff with just like regular people. I don't know how else to phrase it, but you make sure to have not only high achieving people, but also just regular people in the team, so you can prove out that it's not about the individual heroics and skills of people doing this, but it's about the context and the environment that you set up. And so this is a pattern that you see over and over again, as someone put it, right? Like even a crusty old .NET developer can basically learn to do things in a new way and can learn new tricks. And so that's a vital part of changing and transforming the entire organization. So finally, let me just close out with another thing that I see management often doing. It's very important for transforming a large organization. Again, just doing like 2 or 3 or 5 teams is not really that big of a deal, but whenever you're going to do tens if not hundreds of these teams, it takes a lot of effort and a lot of management effort to switch it over. So one of the things, again, that I think only management can put into place is, I don't know the exact frequency that you do it, but what I generally recommend is that on a quarterly basis, you make sure to have basically like an internal conference, not only with people who are doing things in a new way, but with the rest of your organization. And what you do at this internal conference, sometimes you invite people like myself or other pivotal people to come in and like tell you about how awesome software is. But we just want you to buy stuff, so we're very untrustworthy. You should probably never listen to things we say. But instead what you do is you have actual teams that are in your organization that have been successful, and they present what their methodology is, how they've done things, and what their successes are and lessons learned, things they failed at. They basically give a presentation of, here's the new way of doing software, and they're the ones who are kind of providing the training for what's going on. And so if you start doing this on a quarterly basis, and it'll start very small, right? You'll just have a small room of people. But eventually, probably around a year or so, if you've been successful, you'll have maybe something that's twice the size of this room or so. But you'll start to get on this cadence where you've got more and more teams who are successful with this, and they're presenting more and more of how they're doing things, and they're winning the organization over, right? So they're internally marketing why it's good to do things in a new way, but also telling you how they do it. Now, you might also have extra, training sessions and hands-on workshops, people who don't just do slides like myself. But getting to the point where you're doing this internal marketing is incredibly important for transforming, for changing the way the entire organization works. So you see some examples from people like Allstate and Talanix, I can never pronounce that name, but they start to brand themselves as well. So they'll come up with a name for this new way of doing things. Like Allstate, a big insurance company, they call it Composed with a Z, as you can see, because they're developers. And there's a big energy company in the US called Duke Energy, and they have this actual handbook that they put together of their practices and their principles. And I was just there about a month ago. They also have like a huge new space that they've got about maybe like 10 or so teams in that are doing things in this new way. So they have a new physical location they're doing things in, which is also very attractive for people. But it's great to actually get to the point where you can reduce down your new culture, your new process into a booklet that you give out. Or, cupcakes. That's also fun as well. But, what's important is to start thinking about how we market this internally, how we brand it, how we describe this thing that we do, and how we start winning people over to want to do software in our new sort of product mentality rather than just doing things in the old way. So that was a very quick whirlwind tour through things. There's a much better comprehensible write-up in this book if you're interested. But just to summarize, I think there's three basic key things. One is, if you want to improve the way software operates, you need to put in place that small batch process, that loop, right? Where every week we come up with a theory of how to solve a user's problem, right? Whether it's looking at how much taxes they owe, figuring out what their bill is so that they can pay it, so that they don't have to call someone. You come up with an experiment that you run. The way you do an experiment is you write code and you put it into production and you observe how people use it and you see if it solved their problem or not. And then you modify on a weekly basis accordingly. Like if you solve their problem, that's great. You can solve another problem. And if you failed at your experiment, then you have another go at it and figure it out. Now the ability to do that, to deploy on a weekly basis, is because you've managed to centralize your infrastructure all into a platform by ruthlessly removing a lot of the toil that you have. And if you remember that Mercedes example, you don't have to spend like 5 days getting a server or getting network access, or in the case of the Air Force, 10 months going through audit just to release to production. And then finally, if you're actually going to scale this up beyond a handful of teams or kind of a startup scale, you're going to need a huge involvement of management who's also going through that process of reprogramming what they're doing. And there's a couple of tactics that I went over, and there's a lot more if you're interested in this book. But there's some actual management also actually needs to show up. And probably, I don't know if weekly is right, but on a monthly basis or so, think about new processes they're putting in place, new structures they're putting in place, and basically new ways of managing the organization until they also reprogram it to operate in this new way. And then hopefully you can get to the point where you're doing software much better. So thanks for having me here to go over this, and I'm happy to answer any questions if there's any. We have books to give away, so how about if you ask a question, I'll give you a book. Is that good?
We can run out of books.
He'll manage the book giving away. So never mind that. But if you ask a question, how about the first 3 people who ask a question? He told me.
We have 3 prizes.
He told me to give out books for questions. So what are you going to do? But any questions?
Yeah, maybe I guess so.
See, he's going to take all the books.
There is one thing that struck me when you were talking about experimenting and observing outcome. So most of the companies I work for or have contact with have this constant chase of new features. So they were blinded by that. We have to have new features, new features.
Right.
They didn't take time to observe and learn from their mistakes. Is there something that you could recommend, or?
Yeah. So well, there's 2 things. One, sometimes no one cares, right? So they're that way because things are fine, right? And they don't care. Like I've noticed in particular, um, some companies who like are older and more safe, the sort of senior management levels, everything's great, so they don't want to change, which maybe is fine. Like, that's another perspective to take, is like, if there's no reason, if everything's fine, we probably shouldn't change. So that's a cynical reason. So the other attack, when things actually do need to change, right? People need to do things in a new way. One of the things I didn't go over is the tactic that I see people employing is, where did it go? You come up with a strategy for winning people over. Not only with this internal marketing stuff, but basically you find a couple of initial projects that are actual real projects that generate revenue or that are customer facing, that are like not doing so well, and you spend time making those products work better. So as an example, there's an example here from Home Depot, a big hardware store in the US, where they have a business where they rent out like jackhammers and big tools. And they had they obviously have software running that. I guess not obviously, it could be all in Post-it notes. But they have software running that, and it turns out their software didn't actually figure out that you were late returning the tool. So they would never like make money charging late fees. And there were all sorts of other problems. So this is an example of an application that like was not in a great shape, but also like if you failed at improving it, no one would really care because it was already not in great shape. So that kind of application, that was a small application that, that management picked, right? And small in management, right? Not the big management you're trying to change. And they worked on that for a little while, and they actually fixed that problem and started bringing in much more revenue from it, right? And then they went on to another application and another one. So they built up this very small series of successful projects that didn't so much show like the technical skills of it, right? Like, we can deploy every week and we do testing, but that basically showed we make more money, right? Like, by doing software in this way, we actually are improving the business side of things. And so that pattern gets played out to win over people who don't care and who don't want to change over and over again. That you have to go through the effort of picking some small project like that. And then once you're successful at it, and once you've actually generated some revenue, or like with the IRS, solved some big problem that isn't money, well, isn't business oriented, then you can start doing the internal marketing with the people who don't want to change and don't want to move around. And there's also some tactics, like if they don't care about that, if they don't care about making money, there's some ways of also pitching to them that this is a much more efficient way of running, so it saves us money, and we end up having more money left over. And usually people like to save money. I don't know, but if they don't like that, then, you know, then there's no help.
If you make that promise, you have to back it up with some numbers. So
Right, exactly. And that's why you have to pick those initial projects that are, I wouldn't even say a guaranteed success, but these initial projects that are kind of easy wins that have an actual like result from them, right? So what I mean by that is, like, don't do like a conference room scheduling application to like prove out we can do this. You actually want to do something that's like customer facing. And then the other secret of that is, like, the way that you've picked projects is, if you fail at it, you can just pretend like it never happened and pick a new one, right? It's like, if you fail at those initial projects, then definitely you're not going to be able to do more. So you want to make sure to manage those initial projects very strategically.
And you kind of answered my second portion about winning people, because people don't like change.
Mm-hmm.
So we talked about a little bit about changing the management perspective, how they can see our initiatives.
Mm-hmm.
We change people, like developers, how to make them happy and enthusiastic about what they do.
So how do you win developers over? Yeah. Yeah. Well, that one tactic is that setting up a new organization. So there's that. And then there's another thing I didn't really talk about very much, which is, it's kind of a counterintuitive way of going about it. But one thing I see a lot of organizations I talk with is they actually do pair programming, which initially sounds like the opposite of what you're asking. Like, that seems like a terrible idea, to actually have to like sit next to someone and work with them. But generally, most people who are in a technical role, or definitely a programming role, they got into that role because they enjoy programming, right? Otherwise, I mean, that's a weird career choice you made. But you probably end up enjoying writing code, and you like thinking about all the weird abstractions and frameworks and architecture. And what tends to happen in the traditional way of doing development, if you remember all that toil and your walls of YAML, is like now instead of like programming, you're like worrying about YAML and infrastructure, right? And so the first step is like, what if we could have you like only work on like application stuff, right? Like you're only going to be writing code and not worrying about configuring your infrastructure. So then the next part is where pairing comes into play is oftentimes, I mean, when you're working with someone else, so you're sitting with them and maybe they're writing tests and you're writing code, or maybe you're both, you're walking through doing code. You actually end up not only writing higher quality code because you have two people looking at it, and often you write tests at the same time, but there's a very high chance that you're going to end up mostly every day learning something new, right? Like some new way of writing this code, some new framework that you might use, some new approach to it. And generally people who are developers, one of the things, I guess even if they're like very cynically developers and it's only to like make a lot of money, like the way that you make money as a developer is by like knowing new things, like always learning new stuff. So when you're set up in a paired programming environment, and definitely on this fully dedicated product team, you're constantly learning from other people and learning new ways of doing things, right? So, and then finally, like, I mean, I find in general that when developers actually have their software used, like they have it in front of an end user and people are doing something with it, generally that's pretty exciting for developers, right? Like kind of writing code that no one ends up using or that takes forever to get out the door is not as exciting as like, I wrote this code like, on Wednesday, and in the weekend people are actually using it. And I can actually observe what they're doing and I can see the effects of what I'm doing. So, and then if you run through that kind of like sluice of ways to encourage people, I guess you end up with a bunch of people who like don't care about all of that. And I don't know, you have them work on all the old stuff and instead of moving them over to the new thing. But again, I think that's why it's good to have that internal marketing that goes over why things are better, to focus on every week we're getting software out and you're probably doing a lot of pairing to make sure you're learning and working with someone every day to learn new things. And then also, you also get to the point where like you don't have to worry about all that infrastructure junk, right? Like you're more concerned about the actual application that you're working on. And I mean, I guess if you want to program infrastructure stuff, you could go down to the platform team, right? Like that team is also going to be doing a lot of programming to some extent, whether it's just configuring an automation or adding in new services, but there's the option to go down there and do platform work. If you want your users to be other developers or other people who aren't actual end users. I was about to say actual people, but I guess developers are people, but actual normal people. Is that helpful?
Yes. And actually, a couple of remarks that I hadn't thought about that. If people are fine doing older stuff, that's fine. That's their decision.
Yeah.
You don't have to move them necessarily.
Yeah, and there's always, I mean, older is kind of a bad word for it, but there's always a lot of legacy stuff in a large organization, and I always think of like legacy as the stuff that makes all the money. And so it's probably good to have a lot of people focused on that who like know what's going on. And so initially more of the focus might be on the new applications that you build or modernizing some of the legacy things that do need to be updated. But there's always plenty of other stuff to be worked on if people like that.
Could you tell us more about your experience or practices in measuring the user experience from the new bullets? Like you have if you want to reduce phone calls, yeah, you can measure it by looking just on the statistics and you see.
Right.
Yeah. So, but sometimes we have builds that and the features that we cannot measure by numbers, but just
sure.
What's your experience?
Yeah. So the two ways I've seen people measure design stuff, or how you might implement a feature, are, I mean, the first part is a lot of what you described is One, you can just easily observe if someone uses a feature, right? And obviously you need to make that possible by somehow instrumenting it and sort of collecting that log and observe it. I guess it would be log and observing it, right? So I think the most famous example is like, what year is this from? I don't know, it's from 2009 or 2010, and Microsoft did a study of basically, I think it was like somewhere in Bing or something, and they actually tracked people using one feature versus another feature. And this isn't exactly what it was, but let's say it's basic search versus advanced search, and various other things. And what they found when they observed it is that like, no, people only used about a third of the functionality, a third of the things that they had there. So they were tracking usage, as you were saying. And what that means is that basically they were doing too much work, right? Like they didn't need to do 2/3 of the work they were doing because people didn't use it. So that's a simple way of doing things. Now, the next layer that I see people doing a lot is you can do like A/B testing or even ABC testing. And this, when you do this type of testing, what you're doing is you're able to deploy at least two different ways of implementing a feature into production to a smaller subset of users. And this is where having a theory that you observe becomes important, because you need to have a way of validating if way A or way B of doing something is better. So you have to come up with that theory, right? Instead of just two different ways of implementing it, because you're going to run a test of, like what would be an example? I guess we can use the IRS example. So you might deploy two different ways of implementing this feature. One of them is you see your entire financial history, and then you see that one entry for what you need to pay. And so you need the platform that you have and the way you deploy to support collecting from those two different user groups and comparing it. So that gets used frequently if you have the right kind of infrastructure. But then a large amount of what, a larger amount than you might think of what I see people doing is they actually have users come in and they observe them using the software. Or even more frequently, they'll actually go out to where the users are and observe them. So a lot of these large organizations, much of the software they write is used internally. So for example, that energy company I talked about, Duke Energy, they do a lot of software to just run all the line workers who go out and fix their stuff, all their power stuff. And so they'll have the developers, the product teams, go out and just spend time with the line workers and hang out with them and observe what they're doing and observe them using the software. And so that last kind of input, it seems costly, but it gives you like much more, I don't know, it gives you much more of a chance to actually get input about how things are doing, and you can talk to the users. So those are the three general ways of going about it. But there's not really any like magic that I've seen people doing.
Well, who is the leader of the team that's observing? Who should be maybe the leader? It's a product manager? It should be product manager?
Well, initially what you have, yeah, let me think. I think initially like the designer is sort of orchestrating and leading the analysis of it, right? And the product manager will be involved because their job is, again, to like be the parent of the entire product. So they should be incredibly interested in what end users are doing and who they are. And more than likely, the product manager will be the one who knows who the end users are and kind of introduce them, so to speak, to the designer. But eventually, what you see happening, so with those three different roles, they do tend to act independently for, I don't know, a couple of months. But eventually, because they're spending all day, every day together, they're basically on the team working together, often in like one room, for better or worse. You tend to have everyone observing the end users and everyone kind of syncing up on that knowledge. But definitely, the designer is the function that knows how to run experiments like that and knows how to do user research, and they know all of those kind of details. So just like the developer writes the code, the designer's in charge of doing those kind of observations and experiments. Any other questions? Well, great. Oh, yes.
I would like to ask you more about the part that concerns cloud infrastructure, enabling you to not care about the infrastructure, right? So how does this happen technically? Really no work on infrastructure, or?
Yeah, so usually what happens is at the IaaS layer, right? Essentially, yeah, you have full automation and virtualization down there, right? And it depends if you're running on private or public cloud, like on-premise or not, right? So basically, if you're running on public cloud, you layer your platform on top of, I mean, it solves a problem, right? Like all of your infrastructure down to the hardware is taken care of by someone else. So a lot of people instead, organizations want to run on their own infrastructure. And generally, what they have to do is the infrastructure has to be pretty much made into an IaaS, into an infrastructure as a service, like very homogenized and run very similar to how a public cloud would. And sometimes that means running something like OpenStack on top of it to make a full cloud for you. Most of the people I talk with run VMware on it, right? So, but yeah, there is that initial investment of infrastructure to go through where basically, at least from my perspective, you get really dumb infrastructure, right? And you don't really have bespoke infrastructure anymore and customized infrastructure. It's just all a big cloud of things, which getting to that point can be a big deal, right? It can be very difficult to get to the point, not only where you can provision VMs quickly, which is usually easy, but you often have to spend many months going to your networking people and building up trust with them that you can basically automate networking. And then, you know, your security people as well, and so on and so forth. But yeah, I mean, essentially, unless you have an IaaS layer underneath, it's very hard to do any of that automation on top of it, which, as you discovered, I just kind of like slowly went past without addressing. But that layer is important for all of this. So solve that problem first.
I have a question, because what you said is sure important for very large companies. I worked at a small company, and the question is, at which point should we really invest in this platform layer? So that we have dedicated platform people and the dedicated hardware?
Yeah. I mean, well, probably at a small organization, it's good not to have like dedicated hardware. You would run it in some sort of public cloud situation or whatever. But I mean, I think generally, again, depending on all sorts of things, but once you get to like 3 or 4 different products, whatever that may be, you're probably going to introduce enough, if you don't have more of a centralized platform, you're going to introduce enough duplication and sort of operational tasks that it's going to start to weigh down on the overall organizational efficiency, right? And then the other issue that you're going to have if you have, let's say 5, we'll just pick 5, right? If you have 5 different teams or products that are basically running their own platforms or stacks, like you're not going to be able to move those people across the teams, right? And you know, then you're going to have the typical problems, especially at a small organization, of attrition and people moving on and, you know, forgetting how this stack of stuff works for you. But yeah, I mean, generally the advice that people give is for the initial few things, it probably is good to kind of know everything end to end that you're building. And then once you want to scale that up, you want to standardize it very quickly and make sure you avoid the thing where like I was mentioning with the Air Force, with every single application you build out an entire stack of things. But yeah, generally like very small organizations work a little differently. But yeah, I don't know, 3 or 5 or so seems normal. Anyone else? All right, great. I think we only have to give away 3 books. All right, well, thanks again.